and thanks to the Institute for inviting me to give a presentation. I am a very recent fellow. I went to a summer gathering. I can't remember what date it was, but it was a very nice sunny day. And went for a walk up to Ashton Court with Ian and other people. And Ian kindly invited me on behalf of the management team to become a fellow. And I said, thank you very much. I feel it's quite an honor. And I thought the least I could do is to give the members of the Institute some kind of sense of what I actually do. I've been doing it for quite some time. And I think there's a sort of general kind of sense in the air that there are lots of things we need to do, lots of challenges that we're confronted with, many of which, of course, were documented in Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful, 50 years ago, over 50 years ago now. But we don't seem to be very good at doing much about them. And so the theme here is, well, why do we get stuck and what can we do about it? And I'm going to look at this. And if anybody, well, I'll try and get through this. I'd like to have quite a lot of time for conversation. So it's possibly better to do the questions at the end. I don't really want to spend a huge amount of time. So we're going to be using this framework, which is my work, to explore this subject. It's called the Moral Modalities Framework. And it is something that I came up with from around about 2014, based on over 30 years of experience of tracking down Professor Stafford Beer, the founder of Management Cybernetics, learning what I could from him. And I've been applying that in anger, mostly in a IT context, thinking of IT systems as being the nervous systems of organizations and how to make the organizations work better by integrating and upgrading their nervous system. And I've been doing that with quite a lot of success since about 1996. But this stuff is not just about IT, it's about much broader questions about civilization. So what we're going to do, I'm going to start with some historical examples of this stuckness phenomenon. And we're going to look at the cycle of the rise and fall of civilizations. Let's start on a grand level, and then we can zoom into more precise things as we go. So if we look at history, and I'm quite a history buff, there have been 15 Chinese dynasties since starting in 2070 BCE, and the last one only collapsed in 1912. So the usual estimate is there's been 15 of them. The early ones are not very well recorded. They seem a bit mythological. But from about the 3rd century BC, it starts to be very, very well historically documented, with the first empire of the unified Chinese empire, the Qing dynasty, which only lasted about 15 years, but a lot of its characteristics have persisted since then. Then we have the dear old Roman Empire that's generally dated. There was obviously a republic, but the empire ran from 27 BCE and really only collapsed finally in 1453 with the overthrow of what we call the Byzantine Empire, but they call themselves the Romans in 1453, when they were conquered by Mehmed the Conqueror, who was about 21 years old at the time, of the Ottoman Empire. Quite a youthful chap at the time. And another one is the Islamic Caliphate, which ran from 632 CE, the year of the death of the Prophet Muhammad. And that one only really got finally knocked on the head in 1924. We have, of course, the British Empire, which is pretty well known. I didn't bother to put the dates in for that one because that one's more familiar to us. Now, each of these has got it's risen, and some of them have risen with astonishing speed. So if you look at the Islamic one, it starts in 632, by which time it rules Arabia when the Prophet Muhammad dies, and then it it goes into a bit of a struggle because when he dies, they're unruly tribesmen, basically. But within 50 years, they'd spread across the biggest, they created the biggest land-based empire anybody's ever seen. They were all the way from the Indus Valley in the east to all the way across North Africa to Spain in 50 years from nothing. It's kind of extraordinary in a time of not very fast communications. And then they tend to get stuck in a pattern. And that stuckness, either they overcome it, sometimes they do, but quite often it leads to their collapse. So do we know what drives that pattern? And that's an interesting question, I think. So if we look at history, an awful lot of historical writing is really propaganda on behalf of the current winners to flatter the current regime and get influence in court and tell them what they want to hear. But we are somewhat blessed by the fact that we have anthropology, archaeology, paleogenomics, and textual analysis as methods that we can use to get beneath the propaganda to some kind of elements of truth. And the best work I know of in terms of creating an integrated testable model of history is something called cliodynamics that's been running for about 20 odd years, led by a chap called Peter Turchin. And there he is, funny looking chap. He's in his 60s. He's a tenured professor at the University of Connecticut. But interestingly, his tenure professorship is in population ecosystem dynamics. So the population, the mathematical modeling of an ecosystem population, particularly the interaction between predators and prey. So he was one of the pioneers of working out the mathematics of that. He became a tenured professor, became famous for doing that. His background is that his family were thrown out of the Soviet Union in the 1970s when he was about 20 years old. His father was one of the most distinguished cyberneticians in the Soviet Union, but he was also a dissident. And in the end, the Soviets got fed up and threw him out. So the whole family emigrated to the USA. So his first 20 years, he lived in the Soviet Union, spoke Russian, and then underwent this kind of cultural transformation of finding himself in the USA. And having become a professor, he's very interestingly, because he's a tenured professor, he'd taken his expertise in population mathematical modeling, dynamics and so on, and thought, wouldn't it be interesting to apply that to how civilizations work? And it's been surprisingly effective. So over 20 years, they built up the Sechat database, which is a proper database that you can connect to test mathematical models of, well, what causes civilizations to rise and fall. He's recently written a book called The End Times, which is a terrible title, but he probably didn't choose it, which is about the fact that in 2010, he was asked to go on a panel to predict the future of the United States of America. Most of his research has been in traditional agricultural societies, but he found out to his surprise that a lot of what he modeled for them also applies to industrial societies. And he was able to predict that in 10 years' time from when he was speaking, the United States of America would be politically unstable. And my goodness, did he get that right? So he's written a book about how he worked that out, which is quite a deep history of the USA. And a lot of stuff in it about, well, what could happen and what could we do to overcome the worst state of things. So the theory he uses is called structural demographic theory. I haven't got time to talk about it much, but if you're interested in a robust and rigorous way of looking at the history of civilization, this is about as good as it gets. What it basically says is that civilizations start off with mostly kind of charismatic small groups of people who are often actually pirates or warriors. They're the sort of nomadic warriors, and they're very charismatic, and they tend to take over the more settled parts of the world, and they end up as being the elite running them. So there's a dynamic between the state system the fluctuations of population, the relative wages, things like urbanization, urban life versus life in the countryside, the agricultural system. They what they tend to go into is instability with riots and all sorts of stuff like that. This often happens because they don't understand their impact on their environment. So there's a quite interesting book written quite recently by Peter Frankopan, which is a history of the interaction between civilizations and climate, with a lens looking back 5,000 years. But again, it's something that's very interesting. We haven't got time to talk about it in this session. But when things start to go wrong, they tend to go unstable, and this tends to lead to the immiseration of the general populace and people striving to get accredited to become members of the elite, which he calls elite overproduction. You get too many people trying to be in the elite, they get their accreditation, and then they get very angry because they don't get the plum jobs or the plum positions that they expected to get. And then they get very annoyed. And all sorts of things go wrong. This is what happened leading up to the Civil War in the USA in the 1860s. And it looks like unless certain people it almost happened in the 1920s after the Great Wall Street crash, but they turned it around by taxing the plutocrats at extraordinarily high marginal rates like 90%. And distributing the wealth more evenly towards the rest of the population. But we have a pattern at the moment where the USA general population's standard of living has not risen since about 1975, but there is a massive amount of economic wealth creation concentrated in a tiny, tiny elite, which is not a good idea because it does lead to this instability. Anyway, if you want to look at the kind of dynamics of that, the book by Peter Turchin is fascinating. I've read all the books he's written about this stuff. They're excellent. So has there been any example of a civilization that has been able to escape from getting stuck and then going into collapse and then going around the loop again? China demonstrates the longest recorded pattern of this rise and fall, rise, stuckness, and fall, as we already mentioned. But all civilizations display the same pattern. They tend to rise, they tend to get in a state of stuckness, often because they don't understand their environmental impact, and they end up with a population that exceeds the carrying capacity of the ecosystem that they're in. But generally speaking, their understanding of that has been very poor, and it's not something that's been well understood until pretty recently. They get stuck, they collapse. Sometimes the collapse actually causes a crash in the population, which enables the carrying capacity to recover, and then they come back up, which is what happened in Europe in the Black Death, by the way, in the 14th century. But to date, they do tend to eventually die. And in terms of dying, death usually means they get swallowed up by some other civilization. But sometimes they just get stuck in a backwater. And if you look at the Roman Empire, which we've already mentioned, it survived. It moved its capital to Constantinople in 1330 when Constantine converted to Christianity and he established a new capital. He moved from Rome to what has now become Constantinople, named after him, which is now Istanbul. And although the Roman Empire collapsed in Western Europe and plunged into what some people call the Dark Ages, which was a period of massive collapse in population, massive disorder, and a massive deterioration in the level of literacy and other metrics of civilization. And it got stuck in that pattern from about 500 AD and only started to really shift out of it about 1,000 years later. It was a kind of backwater. Nobody wanted to go there because it was not a place that anybody was interested in. But so you do get that phenomenon of being in a backwater. Sometimes you just get another civilization comes and swallows the whole thing up. One of the things I think is really interesting, we're not going to have time to talk about, but it's fascinating, is that cities do tend to be very difficult to kill. Um, a lot of people don't realize that after the nuclear bombing in Hiroshima, they actually had the transport system, the trams and the railways running it 3 days later. It's absolutely extraordinary. Um, and it was terrible. The place was in a terrible state. It was actually run by the Yakuza mafia for about a year because the rest of Japan was ruined as well. And the central government just ignored it, didn't know what to do about it. So it took about a year before the central government paid any attention. It was being run by the mafia in that period, but it did get back on its feet. If you look at the 13th century, Genghis Khan completely exterminated Herat in what is now Afghanistan. And he also extremely wiped out Nishapur, which is now in Iran. They were completely wiped out. He killed every single member of the population. But within a generation, they were back up and running. Extraordinary. But again, we have got no time to explore that further. So what I'm going to look at next is the rise of modernity. And the modern world clearly differs from any of these preceding civilizations. And what's different about it? So it has this interesting interaction between doing science and using science to create technology, using the technology to improve the instruments of observation, to improve the science, to build a better model of things, and then use that to create new levels of sophisticated technology and use them to improve the science. And this is an extraordinary phenomenon that got off the ground. First of all, the idea of it comes from Francis Bacon, who died in 1626 and wrote most of his works about it in the 1620s, who was a very distinguished lawyer and the keeper of the royal purse and all sorts of things. But he came up with the idea, but he couldn't really do it. But it got adopted by the Royal Society after the Civil War and the return of the monarchy in 1660, which became and still continues to be the world's first modern scientific peer group, and still is. So that science technology flywheel is something that no other civilization ever worked out. And it gets off the ground in 17th century England. There is also another interesting thing. Most civilizations, when they come under stress, they tend to collapse because they go into civil war. It's very difficult for power to be passed from one human generation to the next one without civil war, and everything gets smashed up, which means it's not good prospects for anybody involved. So modern war's also got a lot of resolution of methods of resolving disputes without resorting to violence. This again was invented in the last quarter of the 17th century in England with the emergence of what we now know as parliamentary democracy. Nobody had ever worked that out before. Another thing it's got is a very sophisticated financial systems. I'm not saying there have not been very sophisticated financial systems. You can go right back to 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, and lots of very interesting financial instruments already exist, managing treasuries that are in temples that are doing things like working out salaries and running textile factories and building irrigation systems and all sorts of extraordinary things. And the Chinese have been building massive infrastructure involving hundreds of thousands of people that over 2,000 years. And they're very good at it. They still are very good at it. But we've got this very sophisticated financial system, which we kind of nicked from the Dutch and invited the Dutch to invade England in 1688, which was an interesting thing to do. And then the City of London took it up and invented the national debt. So this is to do with central banking and all sorts of stuff like that. Again, very innovative. What we've then, as a result of this science technology flywheel, we've now ended up with instant communications globally, which is also extraordinary. And this civilization, it's not really an integrated civilization at all. It's got different. I mean, China has risen again from apparent disorder, 100 years of complete chaos, and suddenly, since about 1980, it's exploded into this extraordinary power, which is disturbing people. So a civilization with global reach is also unprecedented. And the first one really was the British with their naval power. So the roots of this transformation are interestingly to be found in 17th century England. I do have a presentation I do called The Mystery of Modernity, which is about how that came up. But previous cultures lacked the idea of progressive improvement of the human lot or the means to achieve that. That really gets going in the 1650s in England. First place in the world where that really happens. Most civilizations get to a certain point and they're quite stable and they're waiting for the end of time, like to the Mahdi to come back, or Jesus is going to come and put an end to time and we're all going to live happily ever after, that kind of. Some of them have got a cyclical view of things, the Indians and the Chinese. Others have got this eschatological ending of the time and a new just world will break out model, which is the Christian, Islamic, and Judaic tradition. They disagree with each other about who's going to do it, but they're all waiting for that. But this idea of improvement, so that is, again, it was invented by Francis Bacon in the 1620s. So the big question, of course, is can our civilization become truly sustainable? Is it stuck and can it become truly sustainable? And the Schumacher Institute, of course, is dedicated to trying to ensure a positive answer to that question. That's basically what this is about. So does that pattern apply to other levels of scale below the level of whole civilizations? And the answer is yes, it does. You can observe this at all levels of recursion, from individual human beings, small groups, to enterprises, nation states, businesses, all the way up to the civilizational level. Pretty much, I'm going to contend that the same factors are at work. So we're going to be looking at a model that is there a recursive model that can help us to understand these patterns at all these different levels? And funny enough, I'm here to tell you, yes. So I'm going to take you through this moral modalities framework, which I've devised. And this is something that has been inspired by the work I've from the viable system models Professor Stafford Beal worked at in the 1970s, which I tracked him down to learn about in about 1993. Started to apply in about 1996 and have had great success with. But I realized that a lot of people had difficulty applying it because of psychological barriers to getting it adopted. And so this model, this moral modalities framework, is a sort of 5-dimensional recursive moral philosophy that is built on top of that layer. I treat it as though the viable system model is a sort of the physics of organizations. But physics is difficult to apply, and human beings operate in a world of moral conduct. But my contention is that if you try to think of morality through sort of something like the Enlightenment philosophers, it doesn't really work because they excessively assume that things can be done rationally, but human affairs are not purely rational or worked out by rational attempts. And most of the rational attempts to work them out fail catastrophically. And you end up with things like the French Revolution and a load of lawyers murdering each other and murdering everybody else, and or the Russian Revolution and millions of people died. Best avoided. So what I'm going to look at this is a really, really simple thing. And what I'm going to use it to illuminate the way that a modern so-called developed societies work. It also can be applied to other things, but I'm just going to go through it from our own experience of the kind of society that we actually live in. So if you look at, I'm going to look at 3 levels of recursion, which is levels of scale. from the personal affair, personal level scale, which is small groups of people, families, friends, quite intimate relationships. And then I'm going to look at the level of work activity, of working, going to work to earn a living, which is again a thing that aristocrats don't really understand and try and avoid as much as possible. Traditional aristocrats don't work; that's very vulgar. Somebody else does that for them. But we take work very seriously, and it takes up an awful large chunk of our lives. And then there's the sphere of public affairs. And then I'm going to explore, so the rows here represent different levels of recursion, from the personal to our lives at work, which tend to be bigger scale. And a lot of those are global scale organizations that some people work in. And the public sphere is supposed to be the realm of nation states and things like that. So what we're going to look at is those levels. And I contend that we work through 5 different moral modalities, and we are switching between them all the time. And we all do this all the time, even though we may not be aware of what we're doing or the fact that that is happening. But it is happening, and you can use this to identify that. So the first one I call unconditional care, and this is the one where we care for each other because actually it's the human thing to do. We actually do, at a deep level, humans have got, we're all part of the same human race, and we love each other at a deep level. And this comes out mostly in emergency circumstances, and it sort of goes away when there's not an emergency. And hopefully, when there is an emergency, it comes back. Look at what happened in Valencia. Look at all the people that came out to clean up, even though the emergency services were struggling. So if you look at it at the personal level, and again, I'm going to talk about this through traditional eyes for somewhat, but I'm not being sexist, but I'm just looking at it through traditional eyes. But I know that very, very recently, we don't think of these things as being particularly gendered anymore, but they used to be, and somewhat biologically, they tend to be. So at the personal level, this unconditional care thing expresses itself as mothers looking after hopeless babies. Human beings are the most hopeless beings on the planet when they're born. I mean, if you're an antelope, if you're not running within 10 minutes, you're dead. It takes us 20 to 30 years to get our feet on the ground, bit ridiculous really, but that's what we're like. So we need a lot of nurturing. And if we don't get that, we tend to end up pretty badly messed up. At the work level, this unconditional care is about, well, I have to come here and spend 8 hours a day. I might as well make it as human as possible by not just doing what I'm told to do, but transcending that and stepping beyond that to make an individual contribution beyond that. And this is about individual creativity, but also there are ways of forming small groups of dynamic groups to do really creative stuff without undermining the individual capacity to create. And they don't tend to work on groups of bigger than about 5. And they sometimes get called skunk works, but other people use that in a different way. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. In the public sphere, we're talking about the idea that there's a responsibility at the public level for things like social care for people who can't look after themselves, health care, National Health Service and so on, and also emergency services for when things go horribly wrong, fire engines, mountain rescue teams, that kind of stuff. Then there's a guardianship modality, and this is much more about defining the boundaries of communities and saying, well, who are we? What's our value system? And that used to be done in families by the father. The father's job was to keep the kids in order and say, oi, behave yourself or you get a clip around the ear. You don't do that in this family. You just don't do that. But these days, of course, these functions still have to be fulfilled, but they're not necessarily as divided between genders, sexes as they used to be. In the work environment, it's the responsibility of the board to call executives to account, and that is about chairpersons, non-executive directors who are there to make sure the governance works and that the executive functions don't get out of hand and behave in an unethical manner in accordance with the value system of the organization. And at the public sphere, this is where it gets very metaphysical, because this is the sphere of national identities and religion, traditional religions, the idea that there is a monarch that represents the community, or there is a president that represents the community. It also is the realm of defense of the realm. So there's always traditionally a very strong relationship between aristocrats and war, particularly in traditional societies where the source of wealth is agricultural land. So aristocrats are experts in fighting each other to get control of more productive land so they can be more powerful. That's what they do. Then we have what I call conditioned hierarchies, and these are social power systems. They are the way that most values get passed down. They don't get passed down by rational debate. They get absorbed by people. And it's done by looking up to socially prestigious people and trying to emulate them in some way, to adopt the values and to figure out how to become. I want to become the president. I want to be the top of the tree. I want to be the person that goes on the chat show and everybody listens to me with awe. So this is a very powerful aspect of our lives. In the traditional family, it is the kind of authoritarianism of parent-child relationships. Like, there isn't any negotiation. This is how it is, sharp. This is what we do, and don't question it. Behave yourself. So it's quite authoritarian. In the workplace, it is associated with bosses saying, I'm the boss, you're the subordinate, you do what I tell you, don't ask any more questions, shut up, get on with it. And obviously, this is no longer tolerated as much as it used to be. We consider this to be bullying at work. When it comes to the public sphere, it is obedience to tradition. It's things like the Indian caste system or the traditional Confucian value system of China and other parts of Southeast Asia, where in the interests of harmony, you better obey the authorities. You better obey the Confucian Mandarin bureaucracy or else. And at the top of the tree is an emperor who has the mandate of heaven. And when he loses the mandate of heaven, everything goes to hell. Then there is an exchange modality, which is about what do we do when we can't wield power over each other. We don't love each other, but we've got to get on with it. And we've got to do things like running a supply chain, like you do deals. It's the kind of thing where you've got two parents in a modern family that they negotiate who does the cleaning the floor and who does the washing up and stuff. And because they're not trying to wield power over each other as the traditional roles would have done. It's about how do you get on with your siblings? You know, they could be annoying. You hit them, but in the end, you've got to sort of come to kind of an agreement. It's about how friends get on with each other. You don't try to wield power over your friends unless you're pretty strange. In the workplace, it's about, well, how do you get on with your peers? You can't wield power over them. How are you going to get on and make sure that the work gets done in collaboration with your peers? In the public sphere, it's about the rules of commerce, things like a legal system for regulating commerce, free market economics, ensuring that there is authorities that try to break up monopolies and try to keep things from becoming monopolistic. The final one is the learning network modality, which is about how do we evolve? How do we learn? How do we make our societies evolve as the environment they live in changes? So at the personal level, that is the kind of nurturing form of parenting where you put your kid in a playpen because it's dangerous for them to go astray. But once they get to a certain level, you let them out the playpen because you know that they're more responsible. They're not going to do something stupid like touch the stove or fall into the fire or whatever. So it's about learning from each other. It's about nurturing relationships and trying to enable people to act as responsibly if they're capable of it, and not try to keep them in a subordinate position. So this is in the workplace. It's about the idea of apprenticeship to a master of a craft. It's about mentoring. It's about good management, the idea of management as a service to those who are being managed, not as a wielding of power over them to get them to obey you. And in the public sphere, it's the idea that there should be an educational system to enable people to be responsible citizens who can participate in making decisions about the future of the society that they live in. So that's the model. That it's very, very simple. If any of you are familiar, again, we haven't got time to talk much about it, but if any of you are familiar with the Stafford Beer's viable system model, you might start to recognize that actually this is a five-dimensional moral philosophy built upon the viable system model, because the unconditional care modality corresponds to the idea that there are system one operational functions in an organization, and also an algedonic signaling system for alerting to emergencies and responding to emergencies. And that there is a guardianship function, which is called system 5 in the viable system model. This is about identity. Conditioned hierarchy is the relationship between system 3 cohesion and the system 1's. It's about resource bargaining. It's about, I would like you to turn up. You know, I run a McDonald's coffee shop. I'm the store supervisor. I would really like you to turn up and run for your shift on time. But, you know, if you're going to do the shift from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., please turn up. And I'm going to get quite upset with you if you don't, and I'm going to punish you if you don't. But if you come, I will reward you with money, which you can use to make sure you can look after your loved ones. But it's actually, I also need you to be behaving in terms of regulatory compliance with the fire regulations and keeping the fridge at -5 or +5 degrees so that things don't go off and all that kind of stuff. The exchange is the system 2 coordination between things, keeping things coordinated. And the learning network is the system 4 intelligence function that enables us to evolve an organization to keep it connected with the environment it's in. So I'm going to quickly go through this, illustrating it with the sport of tennis, because it's just a good illustration of how this works. So the guardianship modality says this is what tennis is. It's the Lawn Tennis Association at Wimbledon have been regulating it since sometime, I'm not sure what dates, sometime in the 19th century. But they are in charge of what lawn tennis is. They lay down the rules. If you don't follow those rules, you are not playing lawn tennis. And in fact, you might be playing padel, which is a new version of tennis, but a paddle court doesn't work the same way as a lawn tennis court. And you're not playing tennis anymore, you're playing a different game. So, all right, if you don't want to do these rules, you can invent your own game, but you're no longer governed by the Lawn Tennis Association. The conditioned hierarchy aspect of the thing is players vying with each other and competing against each other to win. And their fan clubs, you know, fan is an abbreviation of fanatic. And fanaticism and passion is what the joy is of watching competitive sport. The exchange modality is making sure the game is fair that the rules are being followed in real time when somebody's playing. And that involves having an umpire, a linesman, a video review system, if people want to dispute whether the ball was in or not. Then the learning network modality aspect is sports science. How do we get better at playing tennis? And for example, we could put carbon fiber in our tennis rackets instead of catgut. But if we do that, is that within the rules? And the answer is that as the game evolves, you have to kick things upstairs to the guardians to change the rules to evolve the game. Or you say, no, you're not allowed to do it. You can't use those kinds of shoes in this game. You can't play it barefoot. This is the size of the thing. So there's that network, that dynamic between learning new ways of doing things and deciding whether they're still inside the rules. So apparently next year's Wimbledon will not have linesmen anymore, the first time, because they've changed that rule. And then the unconditional care aspect, which all these things have got, is looking after people who've served the sport of tennis and can no longer look after themselves because they're too old or they can fall ill. There are charitable foundations and charities. There are also charities for paying for tennis courts to encourage people to play who otherwise couldn't afford to play the game. So that's me sort of saying there's an illustration of this. We get a phenomenon which we call monstrous moral hybrids when the modalities get muddled up and people who claim to be doing one of them, like I'm doing the guardianship, unfortunately are not really doing the guardianship. They're not behaving as proper guardians. And so, again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but if you look at the conduct of FIFA in deciding who was going to run the 2022 World Cup, and it mysteriously appeared in FIFA in Qatar, where the temperature in the shade in the middle of the summer is 35 degrees minimum and upwards. So it's not viable to even play tennis in the summer in Qatar. How the hell did the Qataris manage to win that? And the answer, bluntly, is bribery and corruption. They corrupted FIFA and also bribed people like the French to vote for them instead of competing against them for that particular round of the game. So we have these monstrous moral hybrids, which is a rather grand way of expressing conflicts of interest. There's also the case of what Bernie Ecclestone and the Formula One group did in the German Grand Prix, when it was discovered that money had changed hands for different cities to compete as to who was going to play, where it was going to be. When it was discovered, a court case was brought out against Formula One group that somebody decided that if they slipped the appropriate people 80 million euros, they'd drop the case, and they did. It's interesting phenomenon. So we're going to, and obviously, if we think about this idea of monstrous moral hybrids, they break out badly when things are going wrong. And if you look at the current play of things in a certain place across the Atlantic, the conflicts of interest that we see with the behavior of people like Donald Trump and Elon Musk in particular stand out like a sore thumb. Where that's going to take us, we don't know. It's going to be interesting to find out. So there are different types of these conditioned hierarchies. There's the personal ones, which are extended families and tribes. And for most of the time that we've been on the planet, extended families and tribes have been the order of the day. I mean, they're just putting on the telly in the UK here, the Mirror of the Light, the last part of Wolf Hall, which is all about what happened in the court of King Henry VIII and is all about personal relationships. This is how traditional aristocrats have always operated. It's about influence, impressing the king, serving the king. And if you fall out, if you get it wrong, you do tend to end up dead. It's a dangerous game. And there are impersonal hierarchies, which are voluntarily joined rather than where you're in them because you get born into them. Members are bound by a set of rules. And modernity is very strongly associated with impersonal conditioned hierarchies, which were just kind of unheard of until the 1600s, when people like the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, and these trading enterprises suddenly turned up. Didn't look very dangerous when they turned up in India. The aristocrats just thought, oh, yeah, it's that vulgar commercial stuff. That's not a threat to us aristocrats, is it? But my goodness me, it ended up taking the place over, and they ended up losing their power because they didn't understand how it worked. Excuse me. So what we're going to look at, how do you know when you're in one of these things? So impersonal ones are the ones that dominate at the moment. They have fixed authority figures and prestige. Like once you've been a central banker, everybody listens to you, even if it turns out that everything you did was wrong. Doesn't make any difference. They have power hierarchies. This is just a reference to a sort of workshop form that was demonstrating this kind of stuff. So there's a power hierarchy, and ambitious people want to rise up that power hierarchy. They are fixated on clock time. Time is money is a slogan that comes from there. If you go to anywhere in Latin America, you'll find that people, if you discuss, shall we meet up? People say, do you want to do this on local time or English time? You go, really? This is what happens in Argentina. And local time is much more elastic and relaxed about the clock. English time, you've got to turn up on time. And that's because the English built the railways. You cannot run a railway if you don't follow clock time. It's catastrophic if you don't do it. So impersonal conditioned hierarchies are obsessed with clock time. They like Aristotelian rationality of breaking things down into parts and then reassembling them. They're basically a great thing for keep on keeping on. So once you've got something going, this way of organizing it is fantastic for keeping it going. You keep cranking the handle, and the more you crank the handle, the more you get out. And if it's working properly, everybody loves it because you get a sense of flow, you get a sense of producing stuff. Customers are very happy, and everybody thinks it's great. And everybody likes the competition and social satisfaction. You know, if you work for the Ford Motor Company, you know that General Motors is the eternal enemy and vice versa. But sometimes you change from one to the other. They use marketing techniques to promote and maintain membership. Like, you know, if you get a BMW, you've got higher social status than if you drive around in a little Tata Nano or some tiny little car. And they work very well if they're structurally coupled to the environment. And now what that means is structural coupling is a term that comes from biology. It refers to a creature in its ecosystem being structurally coupled so that it gets everything it needs to survive and thrive and reproduce. If that structural coupling breaks down, that species is likely to go extinct. And what happens with human organizations is that people love being in these impersonal conditioned hierarchies. They get much satisfaction. And then they start to feel it doesn't really work the way it used to. Why is that? What's going on? And they get very uncomfortable. They start to get stressed out. And it's because they're not noticing the environment's changed and they haven't caught up with it. They have not changed to match the fact the environment is not how it was before. So they go unstable when the structural coupling with the environment breaks down. And the tendency they have is to assume that at that point, if we all worked harder, it will go back the way it used to be. So do get more exam qualifications, work harder, get everybody to jump through the hoops, and then everything will be back the way it was. Sadly, it doesn't work. And this is actually, I contend, the source of the stuckness. This is what causes it, is that people are so embedded in these structures, these social structures. They get so much pleasure and benefit from them. They're used to getting rewarded for being in them, that when they start to go unstable, they try to just keep them going and don't know how to get out of that trap. So how do we escape from that stuckness? And by the way, this works. This happens at all levels. My wife is a psychotherapist, and if you look at what psychotherapists are doing, generally speaking, they're trying to help people to shift out of the state of being stuck in a pattern that is making them miserable. So this does work at a personal level upwards. First thing you've got to do is that you have to recognize that you're stuck. If you're not even going to recognize it, you are just going to keep doing the same thing until the whole thing falls apart. And then what you need to do is to switch into learning network modality, because that is the modality that will enable you to evolve your organization to get back to structural coupling with the environment that's changed. So if we could do that, we can get unstuck by evolving our organizations to reestablish their structural coupling to their environment. And there are established methods for the facilitation of this process. Some of you may have come across Ian Kendrick, who's a master at a whole range of these ways of doing things, which is why he got invited to become a fellow, actually, for that. But I don't know whether he's taken it up, but hey. Right, so I'm going to do a bit of a sales pitch quickly for what we are now doing. My colleague Adam has appeared on this call. There he is. So Adam and I have formed this Context Cohere Consulting organization. Literally, we registered it on the 7th of October, so it's pretty early days. So we've established it to assist organizations at many levels of recursion. And we're already working on this. We can assist startups to obtain the resources and skills to get to the point where they've got that structural coupling. A startup doesn't have it. It aspires to get it, and it needs resources to get to that point. Funding, an understanding of how to unfold the purpose and so on. So we reckon we could diagnose the stuckness in established organizations and enable them to reestablish their structural coupling to the environment and show them how to maintain that as the environment changes. Our environment is changing very fast. We need those skills to do that. And we aim to scale our consulting operation by partnering with established organizations in different domains and by mentoring to enhance our decentralized network. So that's what we're about. We also have a not-for-profit entity called Web of Wealth, which we put intellectual property in because we hope to turn it into a registered charitable educational foundation at some point. And it seems appropriate in good governance to do it that way. So how do you recognize a learning network? Because recognizing one of those and what's different about it is kind of important. So it doesn't have fixed authority structures. The authority flows with the knowledge. It has a sense of humor. These impersonal conditioned hierarchies take themselves very seriously. They don't like being laughed at. They tend to get quite upset. It has a non-linear experience of time because linear time doesn't do the job. I've had some of my best ideas in a dream. I mean, I got the idea of this moral modalities framework. I woke up with it one morning. I must have dreamed it or something. I don't know what it was, but then I refined it and tested it. So it uses Socratic methods of inquiry. It asks questions. It uncovers unspoken assumptions. But that, of course, can be dangerous. Look at what happened to Socrates when he did it. He ended up being put on trial and executed, or being invited to take hemlock. So you have to be careful when you're doing this. It feels threatening to members of conditioned hierarchies if you don't treat the thing with delicacy. People tend to join them because they're rather cool, but there's a risk that they themselves become another conditioned hierarchy and turn themselves into one of those and go through the same cycle. But conditioned hierarchies are not, it's not all negative. People get pleasure out of being in them. And when they're structurally coupled to the environment, they deliver the goods. And everybody gets a sense of flow and satisfaction from the fact that they are working. They are stores of knowledge. Most of our knowledge is passed down in the form of these conditioned hierarchies. That's why they've got value, but we have to be careful, because if they collapse uncontrollably, the knowledge can get lost. You can end up burning the Library of Alexandria and losing all the books, or the great Buddhist center at Nalanda, which had an enormous library and was one of the great centers of knowledge in the world, but it got destroyed and was in ruins by the 12th century AD, when Buddhism had been driven out of India. So it's good if they don't get lost. So what's the main cause of stuckness? It's being inside a conditioned hierarchy which has lost its structural coupling without realizing it. Confusing the container, which is the conditioned hierarchy, with the content that it carries, which is the knowledge it transmits. The cure is to learn, this is an old Sufi aphorism, to be in the world, but not of the world. So knowing how to operate in these things without being trapped in them and capable of not being stuck in them. So I would contend that real prosperity consists of being able to operate knowingly in all the cells of this framework in a conscious kind of a way. And that actually we believe that the skills to do this not only exist, but they can be operated, and they can also be taught. So that's it. Questions?
Brilliant. Thank you, Trevor. Indeed. You've taken us on a huge journey, 4,000 years by reckoning from the beginning of
Yeah, it's about right.
right the way through to today, which is fascinating. So many different aspects to this to actually contemplate. I'm very keen to understand the reasons why civilizations have collapsed and whether we can do much about that. Um, and I wondered whether, from just to kick off the questions, whether you looked at the energy link in with civilizations and energy and resources, essentially.
Yeah, yeah.
People sometimes say economy is actually energy. So
Yeah.
that figure
Very
much,
much so.
yeah,
One of the things that's fundamental to states of civilization is not only obviously where do they get the energy that we need to thrive, and traditional agricultural societies do it by mostly by by growing food, and using technical means to enhance that, and working out things like irrigation systems and so on. So obviously they use a repository of knowledge to uncover that. And obviously the trap that we escaped for the first time in the modern world, it starts with this cycle of science and technology, which starts very early on, about 1650 actually, and it takes that cycle quite a long time to get to the point of breakthrough where they discover the deployment of fossil fuels. So you could say that the access to fossil fuels and these additional sources of energy is what escaped the traditional trap which the Chinese Chinese civilization has been unbelievably sophisticated. I mean, you could walk into a market in China 2,000 years ago and buy cast iron pots and pans. They were just a normal thing. You could walk over suspension bridges. Um, you could wear silk clothing. They've been making silk for 1,000 years, and nobody else in the world had a clue how to do that.
Mm.
Um, it took until the 12th century for cast iron to be worked out in Western Europe. It took that long. The Chinese had the wheelbarrow. It took about 1,000 years for the wheelbarrow to get from China to Western Europe. It's just extraordinary. So it's been incredibly sophisticated, but it's tended to collapse because it's gone into a state where the carrying capacity of the environment um, couldn't keep up with the population. And a lot of the systems have got difficulty in measuring value. So if you look at the financial systems, are you measuring the real value, or have you lost track of how to do that?
Mm.
And a lot of our current situation is that we are stuck, I think, with a financial system that makes no sense at all. It's not measuring the right things, and it's optimizing the wrong things. And it doesn't understand that there are other forms of capital than financial capital. And if you ransack those and asset strip them to create financial capital, you are not creating positive value. This is a big deal, very
Mm.
important issue.
Mm. Thank you. I've got many, many other questions on that, but I think it's only fair for other people. And John, you've got your hand up, and I shall um, uh, hand over to you, John.
Well, I was going to say I actually have a couple of comments to make, and I'd be happy to wait until the real questions have been asked before me, if anyone else wants to.
Thank you, John.
Go for it, John.
Okay. Thank you, Trevor. I never tire of listening to you talk about this. I learn something new every single time.
Thank you.
Now, Trevor will be aware of this, but the rest of you won't. For quite a time now, I've been working on the development of software, working alone, really, on the development of recursive nested software, largely to support the exchange modality at the lower levels, recursion, but also the learning network modality, including the ambition to connect it into uh, multiple sensors. Now, I'm not doing this just as a plug, but I would like people to know that this is happening because it's important. Now, earlier Trevor mentioned Ian Kendrick, very, very interesting man. We both been working with. I'll be meeting with Ian tomorrow, as well as with somebody from the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, trying to kick some life back into some software that we've been exploring to support the learning modality network over long term into the future. I think this could be, if we get this going, it could be immensely valuable to the Schumacher Institute, because now I'm going to get on to the real point. I've been a fellow of the Schumacher Institute for a few years now, and in all that time, I've been greatly impressed by this network of expertise. It's to me, it's quite a remarkable range of ethically aligned people. But I do feel it is stuck. I've always felt that way, and I'm not the only fellow who feels that way. I think that there's there's a trick, or there's a collection of tricks being missed. Uh, there's a concentration of effort in what we might call system 4 work, outside and then horizon scanning, looking at what's going on, exploring options for solutions. But there's also, within the extended network, a lot of work going on to actually try to develop solutions largely at a local level. And it tends to be disconnected. This is this is where in VSM terms, whether it's actually more system 1 or system 3 is arguable, but there's the massive conversation the massive multidimensional conversation, which is always needed within any organization to actually maintain the connection between systems 3 and 4, it's not what it could be. It really isn't. And I feel that TSI is not getting anywhere near its potential because this is not being addressed. I still see these bits being fragmented. Now, this is not a criticism. It's not intended as a criticism. This is intended as a note of optimism. I just hope that we can collectively do something about it to realize what I believe to be a tremendous potential for dealing with for developing real solutions here. I'm going to shut up now.
Could I make a very, very quick comment there? I'm going to try and sum up what John's just said. I think what he's saying is, and I think this is true, that the Schumacher Institute is a very powerful learning network. And it is in the learning network modality to a very high degree, but it is lacking in this structural coupling to environments to deliver. I think that is, in a nutshell, what John has been saying. Is that right?
That is certainly an important element of it. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I think sometimes we get a little bit absorbed in that learning because it's so blooming interesting.
Yeah.
Want to do all the time. But I would certainly take on board what you both said on that, and where we should be developing a great deal more our abilities to connect and move forward with this exchange of knowledge and sort of and what comes out of it. So yeah, I'm looking forward to lots of help on this from everybody. Yeah. Thanks.
Very happy to help.
Thanks. So, right. Any more questions from anybody that they'd like to, or comments that they'd like to bring in? Yeah.
I think there's some comments in the chat, aren't there? I haven't looked at them.
No, yeah. Oh yes, Paul there. I just looking at a connection with Jonathan Haidt's Foundation's morality. That was quite an interesting thing. I think whether that is something that you've looked at, Trevor. His work has become very popular recently, as you may know. I think there are lots of mappings of what you've got there in your modality diagram with other ways of looking at things. So I think it's quite important.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the perspective we take is that you've probably come across, again, it's a traditional story, the story of the elephant in the dark. Is everybody familiar with that? The idea that that somebody turns up on the outskirts of a small village. The circus has come to town. There's an elephant in a cage. Nobody knows what an elephant is, but the people from the village get very excited. And some of them go out, still grope around in the dark, sticking their hands through into the cage. And they get very confused because when they come back, because they haven't got a light, people ask, well, what is this elephant thing? And one of them said, well, it's a sort of pillar. It's a great big pillar because he's grabbed hold of a leg. Another one says, well, it's a kind of hose pipe thing because obviously he's found the trunk. Another one says it's a giant fan because he's found an ear. Another one says it's a throne. And they all get very confused and start rowing with each other. No, it's not. And of course, if you turn the light on, everybody would not be disagreeing about what they'd experienced, but they're not joining it up. So I think we are suffering from elephant in the dark. And my attitude is that there are lots of different ways of explaining that. But what we're interested in is being as lightweight as possible with terms to actually operate. So it go from the as economical, Occam's razor in terms of having as little terminology as possible to enable an engagement to take place to get some work done. And we don't know of anything else that's as effective as what we've got here. It may well be that it's out there, but we just don't know about it. But translating from one language to another, yes, of course, we're all talking about the same stuff ultimately, but we're trying to form a language that is as economical as possible to leap into action. We're not trying to write academic papers about this.
Yeah. That's very, very true. And I like that analogy. I think it applies to us a great deal. Especially if you sort of translate the groping in the dark around the elephant into the different methodologies that we apply.
Yeah,
We go for multi-methodology deliberately, but they are all essentially measuring differently. And
yeah. And what you've got to do is contextualize your efforts
yes,
and bring the tool into play
yeah,
that will be effective in that environment. Arguing about which tool to use because you haven't realized, well, that's a nut. It needs a spanner. A screwdriver is not going to help.
no,
It's
exactly.
about once you contextualize things, the arguments evaporate generally.
Yeah. Thank you. James, over to your question. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just never heard any of this before. It's really fascinating. I don't know if it's a kind of basic question, but what was it? Trevor, I'd love if you could say more about structural coupling to the environment, because that seemed a really important concept. Just like
It's
so I can
it's a
understand
very
better.
important concept. Yeah. So what it basically means is if you think about me, I'm sitting in this room in Trowbridge in my house, and if there wasn't any oxygen in the atmosphere, I would be in deep trouble. If I want to talk to you guys, I would be in deep trouble if the power goes off. So what we're talking about is that for me to thrive and to be able to fulfill the purpose that I've got in mind at the moment, there have to be resources available to me. Like this, if the batteries run out on this thing, it's probably going to pack up. I need the power. They need to be charged up properly or they're going to stop. I've got a laptop computer. If the battery dies, whoops. So the structural coupling is simply about being connected to the resources that enable you to stay viable in the environment that you're in. I mean, you could say that this capacity to create these conditioned hierarchies that persist even when they've lost their structural coupling is a sort of spectacular demonstration of sheer human creativity. It's astonishing. John Maynard Keynes made an observation which was that markets can remain irrational longer than you can stay solvent. And that is an example of a symbolic system going adrift from reality, but people can keep it going for a very long time before anybody realizes it doesn't make sense. I mean, from my point of view, I know a lot about cryptocurrencies, and as far as I'm concerned, it's obvious to me that Bitcoin is nothing but a Ponzi scheme. So why does anybody not notice that? And as soon as they do notice it, it will probably collapse. But they haven't noticed it. Does that help? Does that give you a sense of what I'm
Yeah,
getting?
there sounds like there's something in there also about there's a model in the organization about the environment, and the structural
Oh
coupling
yeah,
relates to the accuracy of the model.
correct. That's absolutely fundamental. One of the things about the learning network modality, the system 4 of the viable system model, the intelligence function, is that it's actually manipulating a model of you in your environment. So, for example, if you imagine yourself driving down the road in your car, you have got a model that enables you to predict that if I do this, such and such will happen. If I do that, such and such, right? Oh, there's somebody over there. I can see where he's going to go. He's indicating. So that model is called a Conant-Ashby model. There is a technical term for it. It comes from a paper written in 1970. And that if that model's got what we call requisite variety, in other words, it's got a trick up its sleeve for all the circumstances that occur, you will be able to make accurate predictions and you can navigate your way into the future successfully and arrive at your destination. If you don't have a model with that requisite variety, you will crash your car. So it's a fundamental principle, absolutely fundamental.
Right. Okay. That's really interesting. Thanks.
Thanks. So it's a couple of points that came to me. One is, have you thought through much about over complexity, and the sense that we are building more and more sophisticated systems in which we live, and to a certain extent, they sort of get beyond being able to cope with that. And in a sense, quite a bit of the ethos we have that comes from Schumacher's work is very much looking at sort of an opposite direction, in a sense, a simplification,
Yeah.
and that way of keeping things going. Did that figure much in when you were thinking about the modalities at all?
It figures very, very strongly, because our contention is that, because we've got this proliferating science and technology flywheel going up faster and faster and faster, we don't have regulatory models that are adequate to manage it properly. And the answer to that is that we need to build those models. And I think the Schumacher Institute's work, it could be very key to building models that have got requisite variety, as we call it, to be able to understand the situation. My experience is that the worst thing people do is, because we live in an educational system that rewards having the right answer. Like, you go on University Challenge and you get rewarded. They ask you a question and you know the answer. But in reality, that's not terribly useful, because in the real world, if we're honest with ourselves, we are in a state of extreme confusion about what on earth is going on. But there's a tendency to deny the confusion because it's uncomfortable, and grasp for an answer which actually does not have the requisite variety for you to understand what's really going on. We have to embrace that confusion and stick with it until clarity emerges, when our model is sufficiently rich. That's the kind of work we do. That is what we do, is to help people to do that.
Right. Okay. And it's a case of also letting go in many ways, isn't it? Because if you do have that variety and subsidiarity of decision making, you can't at the same time control it. You have to let.
Correct. Yes, you do. That's absolutely right. You've got to be prepared to surrender and stop imagining that you're in charge, because you can't be in charge of something you don't understand.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Trevor. John?
Sorry, can I just add another footnote? Very brief footnote. The Ashby, the Conant Ashby paper was actually not framed in terms of requisite variety, which was Ross Ashby's concept, but in the very closely related Shannon information theory, which under certain conditions is isomorphic. That's not terribly important, but there's a sort of uncomfortable neutrality about it. It's about the a fitness of a regulator for doing the job, the requirement that it contains a model of the system it's regulating. Now, years later, I'm mentioning this because I think it's very important and not sufficiently well known. Ross Ashby's grandson, Mick Ashby, recognizing this shortcoming, that it applied equally well to systems of oppression as well as to systems of liberation, started formulating his ethical regulator theorems, which place the original Conant Ashby paper in the context of efficient regulation, but not in ethical regulation. Now, I think it's well worth exploring Mick Ashby's work, because he had a particular fixation of the dangers emerging from AI. His untimely death last year, or maybe possibly early this year, seems to have put a halt on that. But I think that this is valuable work that needs to be resurrected.
Okay.
I also just want to add something here. A personal obsession of mine really has been exploring ways to implement what I'd call a Conant-Ashby compliant economy at the local level. That is my view being that an economy should be a regulator for matching resources to needs in a way which is least damaging to the environment and to our descendants' future. This requires a massive amount of information which is completely destroyed by the economy that's imposed upon us through various, again, conditioned hierarchies, I think would be the right term to use in this case. We need a much more information-rich economic system. Trevor knows I'm doing this. Trevor's aware of all this. This is for the rest of you because I need some kind of help. I'm doing this largely on my own. Help! I'm reaching out here. Okay. Not waving, but drowning.
Okay.
Yeah,
Keep waving, John.
yeah,
Keep waving.
yeah, don't drown.
No. Right. Thank you. Anybody, any more comments? I've got one other one that has occurred to me. It's a perspective on things which occurred to me as you were talking about the modalities, Trevor, was that guardianship I would frame in terms of the game idea of infinite game. It's where rules get set and things like that, whilst your conditioned hierarchy is very much what you might call the finite game. They're played out one by one and people win. Have you ever come across that way of framing this? Because I think
Yeah, so that's a good point. I mean, all of these things are recursive. I mean, I do offer people that are sort of 1 day longer thing about all this stuff, which is sort of about a 1 day presentation to get people's feet on the starting line that goes into more depth. So it spends half the time talking about the Beer's viable system model, and then the other part about building on the moral modalities framework. So obviously this has been a quick introduction. Yeah, I mean, the thing about the idea we're looking at here is that everything we're looking at is like Russian dolls. It's turtles all the way down. So Stafford Beer made a very good point that we're all a viable system. Yeah, I am a viable system as long as I'm still here, embedded within the family, which I kind of would like to think was a viable system, and work environments that are also. So we are sort of surrounded by a kind of what he called a shimmering sphere of these viable systems going off in many, many different dimensions.
yes.
And as soon as you start thinking about this stuff, you realize it's staggering how successful we are at navigating any of this stuff because the complexity is mind-boggling. If you started to overthink what you're doing when you drive down the road, you crash. So because there's a kind of interference between the intellectual left hemisphere of the brain and the right hemisphere of the kind of more holistic part of the brain. And you only really get good results when they both operate properly together. If you flip into one of them, you become a kind of crazy cult person, right hemisphere thing. If you go too much the other way, you become a kind of dry theoretician. But to get stuff done successfully, you have to get these things in the proper balance. It's all about getting the balance right.
Great. I think that's the great thing there. Any more points there? Stuart, did you want to say you just put something in the chat there?
Yeah, I can quickly. It's but I hope you can hear me okay. It's just a perspective on confusion in terms of science to policy advice at the EU level. There's been quite a lot of studies done accepting that there is huge areas of uncertainty in almost anything we're giving advice on. JPI and the EU SAM unit have done quite a lot of work looking at how on earth we can make decisions in the face of confusion or at least uncertainty. And there's quite a bit of science around, the science of making decisions in the face of uncertainty, which are still wise decisions. So I often take heart from that and fully acknowledging that there are all those uncertainties. But it's quite heartening to know that quite a bit of work's been done at that level on at least mapping a way forward whilst acknowledging it.
I mean, very much so. I mean, Ian Kendrick's not here today, but he is a master of techniques such as scenario planning, the three horizons model. You may not be familiar.
Absolutely.
Ian is a master of that kind of stuff. He's probably busy practicing it at the moment, which is probably why he's not here.
Very good. And thanks for a brilliant talk. It's been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Trevor. I think that's perfect timing as well. So well done. That's been a fascinating story. And I think it really just opened up our minds to lots of more thinking on so many subjects. So yeah, I shall hang back and say thank you to Emma for hosting today. And
Indeed. Thank you, Emma.
yeah.
Yep.
And look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.